Hello and welcome to another video review, and one that a lot of you have been waiting for quite a while. This is Fallout 2 for PC and Mac, and of course what you're seeing here is the PC version. Now before I get any further into this video, I do want to mention that the gameplay footage is going to look a bit weird, and the reason for that is because I had a lot of trouble actually recording this. For whatever reason, it just did not want to work with my typical recording software, so I had to try different alternatives, and eventually I was able to get it to work, but sometimes the footage looks a bit weird as a result. Unfortunately, that's just sometimes how it goes with older games. Now I do have the high resolution patch for this, so it was able to run in 1080p when I could actually get it working properly, but it didn't always want to record at that resolution, so I did what I could with what I had. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about the game itself. This is a role-playing game by Black Isle Studios and published by Interplay, and it is the sequel to Fallout. It was released in 1998 to a ludicrous amount of acclaim across the board, becoming considered one of the best role-playing games ever made, and was arguably even more responsible than the original Fallout for popularizing the Fallout series. But unfortunately for the Fallout series, it was more or less a pretty steady decline after this, with the subsequent release of Fallout Tactics not being especially well received, and of course the action game Fallout Brotherhood of Steel being downright panned by critics and players alike, and then you get to the Bethesda era as of Fallout 3, which was a mess, and eventually Obsidian, the former developers at Black Isle, got their hands on the series with New Vegas, and we saw a bit of a resurgence, but ever since then it's just been spiraling down into awfulness. But that was all after Fallout 2. Many would actually consider Fallout 2 to be the absolute zenith of the series. So let's actually go ahead and start delving into it and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. How is it as a sequel to the original Fallout, and more importantly, how is it in the grand scheme of the Fallout series? Well, let's go ahead and get right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is really not far removed from the previous game at all. It's still a 2D isometric game, which means it takes place from that tilted top-down perspective, and you're still dealing with a bunch of 2D sprites. In fact, it's all pretty much the same exact stuff you saw in the original Fallout, just with some new art assets that are more or less the same quality level as the original game. Now, of course, with the fairly short turnaround time between Fallout 1 and 2, it's not really that surprising that they reused an awful lot of the art assets, but it does still mean that the visuals are a disappointing side grade more than anything else, and while they do certainly contain that retro-futuristic aesthetic that we know and love from the original Fallout, there's not really anything new or exciting about the visuals in Fallout 2. And then you move over into the sound design and things stay more or less the same here as well. You've got pretty much the same sound effects that you saw in the previous game, but with some very slight additions here and there owing to some of the new weaponry, but it's all very consistent in quality from the previous game, which is to say that it works and it works alright, but there's nothing particularly impressive about it, so that's a bit of a shame. But then you move over into the soundtrack, and that's where they did change things up a fair bit. It does still use tracks from the previous game, of course, but it also includes new ambient tracks that fit in very well and give it its own distinct feel.
And it even extends to the licensed tracks that are in this, which are noticeably distinct from what you saw in the previous game.
What really matters and what have always mattered are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place several years after the events of... I'm a bit surprised I haven't really had all that many requests to take a look at this particular game, because it seems like it's my curse these days to review every Fallout game ever made, not just the good ones like back in the day with Fallout 1 and 2, or even New Vegas later on, but also the crappy or downright terrible ones like Fallout 3 and especially 4 and 76, or the really weird mobile spin-offs like this particular game here, Fallout Shelter. I have no idea who thought this was actually a good idea, but Bethesda decided to jump on the mobile game bandwagon and throw Fallout into the mix, and thus we have Fallout Shelter, which also is on PC for some reason. See, I can kinda understand it in the case of a mobile game, but it's not really the kind of thing that lends itself well to a proper standalone PC title. It's just not the kind of thing PC gamers are Not only was the turret attachment the way to go with the chain gun in the previous game, but it is also the way to go with it in this particular game too, even though you do also get a shield attachment that you can use, which is of marginal use. And speaking of marginal use, the heavy cannon, as it's known in this, or the machine gun like most people are calling it, is more or less relegated to simply being used as a sniper rifle once you get towards the mid parts of the game and later, because once you get access to the dedicated rocket launcher, the micro missile attachment use of what passes for a story in this particular game can be summed up as follows.
Have you seen my father? He's an average-looking, middle-aged man.
Oh sure, there's a bit more to it than that once you get towards the end of the game, but leading up to that point, that's all you're really going to be getting, and it is incredibly annoying going through the storyline that is just that bland and uninteresting. I mean, Fallout 1 and 2 set you forth on these rather epic quests to really save your people, and then you get to Fallout 3. Most of the time when I'm working on multiple projects at once, it's not that big of a deal because I'll be working on, say, a first-person shooter and a role-playing game and an adventure game and a strategy game, and I can keep them all separate, and it's not a lot more in common with the likes of BioShock than it does with the original Prey, and that was a big source of contention with the player base, a lot of whom really wanted a proper sequel to the 2006 Prey. Frankly, I don't particularly care one way or another. I do think it's odd that they just called it Prey when it has basically nothing to do with Prey, but I can put that aside for the purposes of this particular review. And in fact, knowing that this had basically nothing to do with Prey, I was actually able to temper my expectations before going into this. So once you but the real problem comes in when I'm working on a lot of different games of the same types. So, for example, if I'm working on a bunch of role-playing games, or I'm working on a bunch of adventure games, or a bunch of first-person shooters all at once, then I get burned out on them fairly easily and have to go do something else for a while. Now, it is worth noting that even though they did port this over to modern systems, and they threw in high-resolution support, and, of course, modern control versions of the game, and then go ahead and cover the BFG edition content later on in the video, which I've gotten to the end of but haven't finished yet, and the likes of Greedfall, which I'm about halfway through right now, and this sort of thing. Oh wait, now I'm back on role-playing games. Well, good a time as any to go ahead and mention that I've gone through one playthrough of Fire Emblem Three Houses already, and I'm working on the second one. I have 2 more to do before...
Wait for...
in later videos.